Good morning. It is good to see everyone this morning. Our members, of course, but also our visitors, those we don't get to see very often. It's good that we can all be here and worship and study together. We've looked for a couple of Sundays in the past few weeks about leadership and what the Bible has to say. It's in the passages we often refer to as the qualifications of elders, but as we've seen in the last couple lessons, this is by no means exclusive to the men who occupy the office of an elder. These things that are listed in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1, these are things that ultimately are simply meant to help us understand how a Christian should live in any capacity. They're focused more on principles than on details. We're going to look this morning for the next few minutes at possibly one of the most, how should I say this, focused on sections of these two passages, especially when we're talking about elders specifically in the office of elders, the appointment of elders. We're going to look at it as we have been, more from a standpoint of the average Christian, because I think that is ultimately a big part of what is intended here. Elders should be showing the qualities that all Christians should be striving for. We're looking specifically at just a few verses in this text. Let's go ahead and read them together as we begin, starting in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach. We talked about that last time. The husband of one wife. That's part of what we're going to look at this morning. Move down to verse 4 rather. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? In Titus chapter 1, we see something very similar if you turn over there. Titus chapter 1 and verse 6. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers, or some translations say his children are faithful, not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. These two ideas, husband of one wife and ruling your household well, seem in many circles, at least that I've encountered, to be the main focus when we look at putting in elders into the office of leadership. In fact, I personally have seen a lot of controversies erupt over these two issues in terms of whether or not an elder is qualified. I've heard people talk about, well, it says children. If an elder only has one child, what does that mean? Can they still be an elder? I've heard people say, okay, well, the children, does that mean children still in the house? Does that mean adult children? When it says faithful children, does that mean faithful to God? Does that mean faithful to their parents? Well, how do we work all that out? If we're talking about husband of one wife, okay, so if they were scripturally divorced and then got remarried because their first wife was unfaithful, are they now disqualified because they're not the husband of one wife? Or you could have, they had a wife for many, many years. That wife has passed away. Do they now have to step down as an elder? Those are all questions that are, in some sense at least, thoughtful questions. Some of them I think are very easily resolved. But I would challenge us today, while we can certainly talk about that, that's not the focus of this lesson, all those specific questions. I would challenge us today to consider the fact that all of those questions miss the point. Not saying they don't need to be discussed, not saying they're not relevant, but there's a point to these things. Far too often what we do is we reduce the qualifications of elders to tangible things that we can check off. Oh, they meet this, they meet that. And those two are the most tangible. They have a wife, they have children, right? You can see that. That's very evident. Whether or not an elder is perhaps greedy or able to teach or whatever the case might be, those are a little more intangible. So we tend to focus on the tangible because it's easier. And then we get caught up in all these discussions of the intricacies and different scenarios, of which there are so many. Probably many of us have encountered similar controversies. But there's a reason why these two things are given as qualities that an elder should possess. And that's what I want us to focus on today, because if we understand that, not only will I think it help us with those other controversies that we could get into, but It'll help us understand the point that applies not just to elders, but to all Christians. What do these things have in common? That's the first question we need to ask as we look at this topic. What do these things have in common? Being the husband of one wife, ruling your household well. By the way, before we get too far into it, I want to make one point that might help us. The husband of one wife, as is often translated, should really be translated a one-woman man. The emphasis, if you really understand the phrase as it is used, is on faithfulness to one's spouse. Probably most of y'all, I think, in this room, lived through an interesting event in our political history recent political history. The scandal surrounding Bill Clinton and one of his interns. That scandal, although I'm not old enough to remember it personally, that scandal, as I have read, became a huge deal for multiple reasons. Of course, there was the fact that a president of the United States was caught being unfaithful to his spouse. There was also the issue that he was caught lying about it to a court system, or maybe it was the Senate. I don't remember exactly the details, but in a place where it was perjury for him to lie about that. And there were a whole lot of issues that came out of that scandal. Why? Why was it that something like that, it wasn't just that particular president, there's been several presidents who similar things have come to light, maybe not in such a public way, but we know several prominent individuals as well as government officials, as well as church leaders, or at least religious leaders, several public figures who have had scandals like this come up where they were caught being unfaithful to their spouse. Why is that a big deal? Especially for a public figure. Isn't that just their personal life? It's a big deal because we understand it reflects on their character at large. Now, I'm not trying to get into specifically the character of any particular public figure, but the idea is those kinds of scandals are a big deal because they reflect on character beyond that specific incident. Inherently, we understand if someone is going to not live up to a commitment they made in one area of their life, that hurts their credibility when they make other commitments. If someone is not going to fulfill responsibilities in one area of their life, that makes us doubt whether they will fulfill the responsibilities elsewhere. So when we look at this idea of being a one-woman man in the case of an elder, or treating your household, rather running your household, ruling your household well, the idea that we see here goes far beyond technical specifications of the makeup of a person's family. It's a reflection on how well they keep commitments and fulfill responsibilities. Specifically, very personal, very immediate commitments and responsibilities that are kind of the first line of, how their character will be revealed. You know, you can have someone, and probably, unfortunately, some of us have known this to be the case personally. You can have someone who seems like a very good person, man or woman, very good person in all their interactions with everyone else, but if you ever see them in their home, their true character becomes revealed. Because that's where they live. That's where they are at the most basic level, who they really are. In Genesis chapter 38, verses 8 through 10, we discussed this a while back in talking about the story of Judah and Tamar. Genesis 38, there is a man who has a wife, and the man is a very wicked man, and he is killed. Under their law, the brother has the responsibility now to marry that woman and to raise up descendants for his brother. But we're told Onan, that's the name of the young man who had this responsibility, who was supposed to make this commitment, he recognized that he would be doing this for his brother and not for himself. And he selfishly did not like that. And because he refused to fulfill his responsibility, God struck him dead. That was how serious God took it, that he did not fulfill his responsibility, that he did not keep his commitment. Similarly, Eli, in the book of 1 Samuel, toward the very beginning, as we're introduced to the young man Samuel, he is sent to live with Eli, the priest. And we're told something very disturbing about Eli's sons. Eli's sons are profaning the sacrifices that they are supposed to be offering on behalf of the people. Eli's sons are taking advantage of their position to take advantage of other vulnerable individuals. They are in every way bringing disgrace upon the priesthood, upon Israel, and upon the worship of God. And God sends word to Eli, not only that his sons will suffer the consequences, but he specifically blames Eli. Do you know what he says? He says, "You have honored your sons before me." You see, Eli, as not only the priest, but also the father of these children, was in a position and had every right to take action, even perhaps drastic action, to stop this from happening. This was a crime against God and man. And yet, for whatever reason, it seems because they are his family, while he gives a half-hearted attempt to say, "Stop it," he doesn't actually do anything to stop it. And he is told he will share the fate of his sons, because he has not fulfilled his responsibility as their father. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, we see a discussion here, maybe briefer perhaps than we see in Ephesians chapter 5, but a discussion of how a husband should treat his wife. It says he is to honor her as the weaker vessel. He is to protect her. He is to treat her with respect. And notice all of those things are summarized, if you will, in the very last little phrase of 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. There's a reason why he is to do that. So that his prayers will not be hindered. I want us to pause and think about how much God values the degree to which a man will fulfill his responsibility to his wife. If a man does not love his wife as Christ says he is to love her, if a man does not honor her and protect her, God says your prayers will be hindered. In other words, I won't be as inclined to listen to what you come to me asking because of how you treat your spouse, because of the lack of responsibility you are showing, the lack of commitment you are showing in this woman to whom you have said you will commit your all, second only to me. That's how much God values the responsibility, the commitment that we have to our families. And while many of these things, yes, are focused on the man in this scenario, both man and woman have responsibilities in any home relationship. Even unmarried men and women still have responsibilities in their relationships, in their family situations, responsibilities to their parents. Of course, we have the passage, right? If anyone will not care for his own, they're worse than an unbeliever. We see very strict requirements given, even in the New Testament, for children to take care of their parents. There are responsibilities and commitments that have been made just by the very nature of our situation as family that God expects us to honor. And when we think about it, those are basic. We could go into a lot of other commitments and responsibilities we have made, should make. Responsibilities that we have been given, should be fulfilling. But family responsibilities are the first line, if you will, are the first place where that should be evident. They're the smallest area of life, if you will. The most basic requirement. And if we think of it that way, Jesus' words in Luke chapter 16 and verse 10 should come to mind. If we are faithful in little, we will also be faithful in much. But if we're unfaithful in little, we'll be unfaithful in much. For all of us, not just those men who might be one day or currently in a position to be elders in the church, for all of us, man and woman, old and young, how we interact with our families tells God how we feel about commitment and responsibility. My family life is an indication of that. It becomes very evident very quickly where my true character is when the only people who see it are the ones who live with me day in and day out. My family life is an indication of my commitment and responsibility. That, I would argue, is the focus, the principle behind why these things are listed as elders are being discussed in 1 Timothy and in Titus. So that helps us to understand then, as we look at specifically this idea of the husband of one wife or a one-woman man. I want us to think about this question. If I'm unfaithful to man, meaning to a human being, why would I be faithful to God? If I'm unfaithful to a fellow human being, why should God expect me to be faithful to him? Have you ever seen someone lie about someone else? You're there, you're present, you're listening to them, and they tell you something you know to be untrue, and you know they know is untrue about someone else. What does that do in your relationship with the person who says that? Not only do you know they're not telling the truth about that person, doesn't it start making you question, well, what are they saying about me? What are they telling other people about me that they know is not true? It hurts credibility, right? As God looks down on us, on our society, and sees a growing number of individuals who are saying, till death do us part, even in the church, and not living up to that commitment. Don't you think he feels the same way? If that person would tell that lie to them, why should I trust it when they make a commitment to me? After all, at the most basic level, being married is not as high of a commitment as being a Christian. Don't get me wrong, being married is the highest commitment you can have to another human being, and yet it pales in comparison to the commitment God requires of us to be a Christian. So if we can't cut it with that commitment, if we're not willing to be faithful to that commitment, how would God in any way think we're going to keep our commitment to him? In Malachi chapter 2, throughout this book, Malachi the prophet is getting on the Israelites' case, because even though they have gone through this whole period of enslavement and exile and finally have been returned to Judah, hopefully having learned their lesson, he's telling them, you haven't learned anything at all. You're breaking the covenant constantly. And in chapter 2, he goes into detail about one of the ways they're breaking that covenant. He says they're covering the Lord's altar with violence and tears. And in this book, he kind of plays both sides and has them say, well, why are we doing that? What are we doing that's causing that? Because you are not being faithful to the wife of your youth. You are discarding her. You are revoking your commitment to her. And that tells God that you are not committed to him. In Ephesians chapter 5, now we come to this passage that goes into even more detail than 1 Peter chapter 3 does about this relationship between the husband and wife. There's so much beautiful imagery here, so much given to us as a description of how that relationship should look. But do you remember what Paul says at the end of that chapter? This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. He uses the closest relationship two human beings can have, at least it should be the closest relationship. He uses that to describe, to help us understand the relationship that should exist between Christ and the church. Well, what does it say about us if we're not willing to fulfill that commitment to a human? And yet that's meant to show us how we should be committed to Christ. This is not in any way exclusive to men who occupy a certain responsibility within the church. We make commitments in this life. And God's watching. In Revelation chapter 2, in verse 22, as he's speaking to the church in Thyatira, again, using a lot of figurative language, he describes this woman named Jezebel. Probably a description of the type of woman she is, rather than literally her name, but it could possibly be her literal name. In either case, she is causing this church, or at least many in this church, to compromise with the world, to partake in various aspects of idol worship, of pagan religion. And God describes that as adultery. There might even have been some literal adultery taking place as a part of those rituals, but the overall point is that this individual is pulling them away, causing them to abandon their commitment to God. And yet God uses the idea of adultery, of the violation of a commitment between husband and wife, to drive home the point of what it means to him for us to violate our commitment to him. How can Christ trust my commitment to him if my word means nothing? For any of us. Not only those who are or might one day be elders. Ladies, I know it's probably very easy to read these sections and say, well, this is talking about elders, so I can skip this. The principles here are meant for us all. How can Christ trust my commitment to him if my word means nothing? In any context. He was faithful in little. He's faithful also in much. But thirdly, I want us to ask this question, moving on to that second part that he focuses on. The idea of ruling your household well, of helping to raise the children in a godly way. If I can't handle my responsibilities, will I get promoted? Think about that in the context of the workplace. If I'm given responsibilities in the workplace and I don't fulfill them, I prove unable to handle those responsibilities, what's going to happen when it comes time for promotion? I'm not going to be the one who gets it. I mean, that should just be a basic common sense, right? Now, of course, you can talk about unfairness and nepotism and all those kinds of things that can interfere, but as it should be, if I can't do the work that I'm supposed to do, I'm not going to be rewarded for that. If anything, I'm going to be punished. Fathers in particular, as leaders in the home, are given a grave responsibility. Mothers also, a great responsibility in the raising of children. Those who don't have children, they still have many responsibilities that are given in this life. He's focusing on this specifically, it seems, because generally speaking, at this time especially, if you have a wife, you have children. That was something that society particularly emphasized as what needs to happen. You get married, you have children. And yet, far too many, even in that basic, should be natural responsibility, feeling of this is something that's important that I need to do, many, both then and now, do not take that responsibility seriously. There's a great deal of pressure in our society to allow children to do whatever they want. Not give them any guidance, not put forth the effort to train and teach and help them become who they need to be. I haven't been a parent. I have been a child. And even having not lived that myself, I can tell you, it's incredibly difficult. It is a massive responsibility. And I say that knowing full well that I don't even get it yet. But if we can't manage that responsibility, one of the most basic, fundamental responsibilities given to us by God in this life, how are we going to manage our responsibility to God? In the case of elders who are being put in a leadership position, If they haven't fulfilled the responsibility in the home, why would they get promoted to govern the whole church, to help lead the whole church, to shepherd them, to oversee them? That's why this is there. Again, we could talk about all the issues related to, well, what does it mean if the child moves out of the house and is no longer faithful to God? Again, that's another discussion for another time. I think this will help us understand the emphasis that Paul is giving. But the point is, for all of us, God expects me to fulfill the smaller responsibilities that I have, if I have any hope of fulfilling my responsibility to Him. In Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 26, we just talked about this on Wednesday night. Like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so is the sluggard to the one who sends him. In other words, the one who is not willing to fulfill their responsibilities is going to cause nothing but pain if someone asks them to do something. So if I had proven myself not to fulfill my responsibilities, why would God ask me to do anything? Because I'm only going to cause him pain. By this time, the author of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 5, by this time you ought to be teachers, and yet you need someone to teach you again. They had a responsibility to not only learn for themselves, but learn to the point where they could help others. And yet, the author says, you're not even ready to help others because you haven't taken on the most basic responsibility of growing yourselves the way you need to. Of course, we are familiar with Jesus' parable of the talents. To each one, there is something given. Talent being, of course, a unit of currency in their time. A very large unit of currency, by the way. Each one is given a responsibility. Now, those responsibilities vary. But whatever that responsibility is, we are expected to take it seriously. And we will give account. God expects us to be able to meet the responsibilities He wants us to fulfill as His servants. But what does it tell Him if we can't even fulfill the responsibilities we have to those around us in this life? God cannot entrust me with His work if I'm failing to accomplish my own. That's the focus of these requirements. When Paul tells Titus and Timothy what to look for in men who will be leaders of the church, he's describing things that apply to all Christians. Not specifically, no, not everyone is technically the husband of a wife. Not everyone has children. That's not the point. Yes, he is saying that literally for the eldership, but he is talking about that figuratively, in principle, as something that applies to all. God cannot entrust me with His work, a work that every Christian is responsible to do, if I'm not even accomplishing my own work. We have a responsibility. We have made a commitment far greater than even the vows that we have made to our spouse, for those who are married. Are we fulfilling it? Are we people who Christ would look down on and say, they are committed, they are responsible, even in the little things. They have been faithful, and so because the fields are white for harvest and I need workers, I want to put them to work. Or does he look and say, I can't find anyone to do the work? They haven't even done their own. Who are you this morning? Have you proven yourself faithful in a little so that God can give you the most important work in the world to do? The work of His kingdom. The work of preparing yourself and others for the next life. Nothing is more important than that. Can He entrust you with that commitment, that responsibility. If we can help you to equip yourselves for that, we invite you to come as we stand and sing.